Marco Polo lived in Venice, Italy, around 750 years ago. Back then, in the 1200s, most individuals lived their whole lives where they were born. But not Marco Polo. He traveled 11,000 miles to China and returned, and he became Europe's most renowned traveler. Not only did he go on such a lengthy and perilous journey, albeit few others in Europe had done so at the time, but he also authored a book about his experience. Marco, like his father and uncle, was a trader. The Polos wanted to go to Asia to bring back silk, spices, and other high-end products for sale in Europe. Marco traveled to China as a teenager and did not return to Italy for 24 years. China's ruler was Kublai Khan. He admired Marco and sent him to neighboring nations to spy. Marco collected notes on the sites he visited and the habits of the people he encountered. He utilized these notes to create a book on his trips. Reading his book was how many Europeans learned about Asia. Explorers like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama read Marco's work 2 centuries later. It fueled their desire to go to Asia as well. But they hoped to discover a more straightforward path. Is everything in Marco's book true? Historians believe he overstated here and there. Some believe he never traveled to China at all. Nonetheless, his book catapulted him to international fame. What is the genuine tale of Marco Polo? Chapter 1. A family of merchants. 2 events made the year 1254 significant in Marco Polo's life. First, it was the year of his birth. Second, it was the year his father, Niccolo, and uncle, Maffeo, departed Venice on a merchant journey to Asia. Marco's father had been gone for so long that he was 15 when they finally reunited. Marco's mother died shortly after he was born, so he was transferred to live with his family. As a boy, he did not attend school much. Instead, his family taught him the skills to become a trader. For example, the Venetians used silver grossos and gold ducats. Marco needed to know how to weigh the money appropriately. Venetians had their own measurement method, which involved using their hands and feet. For example, 1 palm measured around 9.5 inches. They would have measured clothes in palms. Other nations utilized various currencies and measures. Marco also needed to learn about them. Otherwise, merchants may deceive him. The sailors and merchants Marco encountered on Venice's waterfront also taught him about commerce. Venice was the world's most powerful commercial metropolis. Its active port, with ships continually arriving and leaving, was on the Adriatic Sea. Venice was unlike most cities. It was a collection of 118 small islands linked by waterways. Marco and his family visited the canals in long canoe-like boats known as gondolas. Back then, Italy was not a nation. It was a collection of city-states. Each city-state controlled itself. Venice was one of the biggest, with up to 100,000 people. Venice exported various goods, including timber, wheat, and salt. Salt was quite precious in those days. Much of it washed ashore on Venice's shoreline. There were no freezers, therefore people used salt to protect fish and meat from spoiling. Without salt, they perished within a week. However, once salted, these items may survive for months. This was especially crucial for lengthy maritime voyages. While Marco was growing up, his father and uncle continued to travel. By 1260, they had reached Constantinople, now Istanbul, Turkey. They exchanged the items they had brought from Venice, and the Polos were compensated with jewelry. After crossing the Black Sea, they headed east along the Volga River. They went to the trade city of Bulgara to see Berk Khan, a Mongol king. The term Khan means ruler. In exchange for their diamonds, Berk offered the Polos items worth twice as much. Everything was going nicely. Unfortunately, a battle broke out between Berk and another Mongol monarch, Hulagu. Both were the grandchildren of Genghis Khan, a tyrant who had died more than 30 years before. The Polos were prepared to return home. However, the fighting closed the path back to Venice. Because they couldn't move west, they opted to head east to Bukhara in Uzbekistan. They were locked there for 3 years. Then in 1265, Hulagu dispatched several emissaries to China to see his brother, Kublai Khan. Kublai and the other Khans arrived from Mongolia, which is depicted with stripes on the map. The people of Mongolia were known as Mongols. Hulagu's emissaries approached the Polos and invited them along. The Polos agreed. This was a courageous choice. Few Europeans had ever visited China, which they named Cathay. Back then, people believed there were just 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. They thought China was at the far end of the planet. Bandits, battles, delayed transit, and poor roads made it difficult to access. It took the Polos and their messengers nearly a year to reach Kublai Khan's palace in the Mongol capital. now Beijing, China. Niccolo and Maffeo were among the first Europeans Kublai had ever encountered. When they arrived at his court, he greeted them and inquired about Europe. Eventually, Kublai instructed them to deliver a message to the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church in Rome. In those days, the Pope was also a significant political figure. The Polos were to request two things. 1. 100 Catholics, priests who had studied algebra, astronomy, and other topics. 2. Holy oil obtained from a specific church in Jerusalem. The sacred oil was supposed to have exceptional properties, which the Khan most likely intended to utilize against adversaries. Kublai wanted the Polos to return to China with these items. He said that if the priests could show that Christianity was the finest religion of all, he may become a Christian himself. Did he really mean it? Kublai was indeed interested in learning about many faiths. It's also conceivable that he believed the missionaries might assist him in acquiring control of Christian areas. The Polos claimed they would return with the items Kublai had requested. They left China and returned home. Chapter 2. Marco leaves home. By the time the Polos returned to Italy in 1269, the Pope had died. They waited and waited for another Pope to be elected. 2 years later, in the spring of 1271, they stopped waiting and returned to China. Marco was now 17. He also wanted to travel to China. He did not want to be left behind. His father and uncle were aware that the journey would be difficult. Nonetheless, they decided to bring him along. They sailed from Venice to the Adriatic Sea and then south to the Mediterranean Sea. Sailors used to assume that the sea was full of gigantic monsters. Perhaps Niccolo expected his kid to get afraid and turn back. Marco never did. Their first destination was Acre, and then they continued to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a sacred city for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Essential events from each faith occurred there. Jesus lived and died in Jerusalem. King Solomon established the first Jewish temple there. The Islamic prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven at Jerusalem. Jerusalem's ownership has shifted many times throughout the years. Armies of Christian knights seized the city in 1099 as part of the Crusades' military operation. In 1187, Muslims took possession of the city. The Polos stopped at Jerusalem, still under Muslim dominion, and collected a sample of the church's unique oil. After that, they went out for China. They hadn't gone far when they learned that a new pope had been elected. Fortunately, he was close in Acre. The Polos informed him of the Khan's request for 100 priests. The new pope listened. He decided to send some pricey gifts, such as crystals. However, he would only send 2 friars, not priests. In a letter to the Khan, the Pope said that the 2 friars would teach Kublai's troops to be priests. Then the new Mongol and Chinese priests could spread Christianity. Would this adjustment enrage Kublai Khan? The Polos hoped not. They needed the Khan's goodwill to ensure that no one from his dominion hurt them. That way, they could purchase Chinese products and securely transport them to Europe. They intended to bring back porcelain in addition to silks from China. Porcelain is a kind of pottery created from a specific white clay and decorated with attractive motifs. In Marco Polo's day, there were 2 main ways to go to East Asia from Europe: the Silk Road and the Spice Route. The Silk Road was around 5,000 miles long and mostly traveled on land, while the Spice Route was mostly traveled by sea. Both routes were named for the things Europeans wanted most from Asia: silk and spices. When a trader reached a city, he sold his goods, wood for example, to another merchant, who then took the wood further along the route to another town, where traders sold it again. The goods changed hands several times before reaching China, where they were traded for silks and spices. At this point, the return trip begins. Each trader charged a little more for the resold goods because they wanted to make a profit, and by the time the goods got to the end of the journey, they cost much more than when they begin. The Polos searched for diamonds, rubies, and pearls across Kublai's dominion. In Turkey, they would purchase beautiful carpets. They desired spices like nutmeg, cinnamon, and pepper from India and the Spice Islands, now known as Indonesia. Back home, they could sell everything and become wealthy. In November 1271, the Polos and 2 friars returned to China. First, they sailed north across the Mediterranean. When they attempted to land in Armenia, they encountered problems. The Egyptians were assaulting it. The 2 friars were worried. The expedition had only just started, and already there was danger, so they turned back. The Polos kept on, but now all they had was holy oil to bring to the Khan. Chapter 3. A long trip to China. Marco experienced some unusual things on his route to China. He wrote about them in his diaries. Because he was a trader, he paid close attention to the goods of each region. He also recorded any risks, and if food and water were readily available. Perhaps he believed this knowledge would benefit other merchants who journeyed to Asia after him. One of the earliest and most well-known places he viewed was Mount Ararat in what is now Turkey. According to the Bible, this is where Noah's Ark landed during the Great Flood. The peak was always covered in deep snow, so Marco saw no use in coming up there to look for the Ark. Marco initially saw natural oil wells near the Caspian Sea. This oil is the kind utilized to produce gasoline today. People in Europe at the time used fires, candles, or animal or vegetable oils to provide light. Marco was astounded that the oil he saw in Asia originated from the earth. He referred to it as a fountain from which oil springs. Marco visited 3 notable graves in Persia, today known as Iran. The graves were thought to be of the 3 wise men who visited the newborn Jesus. Marco said the 3 wise men were buried in 3 large and beautiful monuments side by side. Throughout the lengthy voyage, plans changed continually. The Polos were ambushed by robbers in Persia, but they were able to flee. To avoid more encounters with bandits, they decided to continue south toward the Indian Ocean. Water travel may be safer. They looked for ships at Hormuz, a city in the Persian Gulf. Hormuz was an important commercial location where Indian merchants came to sell spices, pearls, silk, and ivory. Marco said that sometimes a wind blew there that was so hot that it could kill. When the inhabitants of Hormuz heard this wind approaching, they dove into the closest stream until it passed. They were kept together using coconut husk rope rather than nails. The Polos concluded that going overland could be safer after all. The Polos turned around and proceeded north into what is now Afghanistan. There they discovered a fantastic ruby mine. They noticed wild sheep with curling horns that were 5 feet long. These sheep were eventually dubbed Ovis Poli, which translates to polo sheep. Marco had been unwell for a time at this point. He had heard a rumor that inhaling pure air in the highlands of Afghanistan could heal any disease. After sleeping in the mountains, he recovered and they carried on. There were plenty additional unique sites in Afghanistan. Marco advised Balkh residents to keep an eye out for lions. In Shibargan, he discovered the very best melons in the world. The mountains of Talikan were made of salt, which was so hard men could only break it with iron picks. Marco believed there was enough salt there to supply the whole world to the end of time. Salt was valuable back then, so he was impressed. When the Polos arrived at the city of Lop, they had traveled 5,000 kilometers. However, before arriving at Kublai Khan's palace, they must traverse the deadly Gobi Desert. This desert spans 500,000 square kilometers in northern China and southern Mongolia. Dunes or sand mountains grow up to 250 feet in elevation. That is as tall as the Empire State Building in New York, excluding the antenna. In Lop, the Polos purchased food and plenty of water. They hired camels, sometimes known as ships of the desert. If required, a camel can survive without water for up to 2 weeks and without nourishment for much longer. Its large feet prevent it from sinking deeply into the sand. Its powerful jaws enable it to consume prickly desert vegetation. Long eyelashes prevent sand from blowing into its eyes. It can even seal its nostrils to prevent sand from entering its nose. The Polos traveled across the desert at night since it was too hot during the day. Sandstorms in the Gobi Desert may kill tourists. They would stop at an oasis once a day to relax and replenish their provisions. An oasis is a desert location with an underground water source. Small communities have developed around the Gobi's oasis. Marco heard weird noises in the desert, like people marching, conversing, and drumming. According to mythology, it was an army of ghosts. Sometimes people pursued spirits, got lost, and perished. High winds and shifting dunes really created the noises. It took the Polos a month to go 600 kilometers across the Gobi Desert. Kublai Khan learned of the Polos' homecoming at his palace in Shangtu. Shangtu is located in modern-day China's Hebei region. He sent escorts to accompany them to his palace. So the Polos traveled through what are now the provinces of Gansu, Shanxi, Shaanxi, and Ningxia. After such a lengthy trip, Marco may have questioned whether he'd ever meet the mighty Mongol leader he'd read about. Chapter 4. The Mighty Kublai Khan. A few days later, the Polos landed at the palace at Shangtu. After 3.5 years of journey, Marco finally met Kublai Khan. Marco stated, "There was great rejoicing at the court because of their arrival. They met with attention and honor from everybody. The Khan was pleased with the Pope's letters and presents. He was glad to see the Polos and was not upset that no priests had accompanied them. Marco was 21 then, and the Khan was almost 3 times his age. Marco said the Khan had dark eyes, a light complexion and a medium height. He was very astonished by the Khan's wealth and mansions. The Khan's summer residence at Shangtu was composed of white marble. It was adorned with gold and enclosed by a 16-mile wall. There were lovely gardens inside the walls with 10,000 white horses grazing. 10,000 horses. Marco said there were. Kublai rode his horse around the park, followed by another horse carrying a pet leopard on its back. During the winter, the Khan stayed in another palace close north of Beijing, the current capital of the People's Republic of China. The Polos also visited the Winter Palace. Its halls were adorned with gold sculptures and murals depicting dragons, monsters, knights, and birds. Marco said that the dining area could accommodate up to 6,000 visitors. Other chambers held valuable items that only the Khan was permitted to glimpse. A magnificent garden around the castle was filled with deer, gazelles, and other animals. Whenever Kublai saw a lovely tree, he had elephants transport it to this park so he could plant it. Mile-long walls encircled the palace with guard towers at each corner. The most giant gate in the wall would only open for the Khan to pass through. Every spring, Kublai took a hunting excursion. He didn't hunt himself. His slaves hunted while he watched from a large tent. Marco said that there were 5,000 hunting dogs and 10,000 falconers. Falconers carried falcons that would attack other animals when unleashed. Kublai Khan accomplished everything in a tremendous manner. Even his family was large. He had 4 wives and 47 sons. Nobody knows how many daughters he had. His favorite wife's name was Chi. She helped the Khan comprehend the habits of the people he controlled, allowing him to be a better leader. When Marco encountered Kublai, he had been king of the Mongol Empire for 15 years. Although other Khans existed in Asia, Kublai was the most powerful. Unlike other warriors, Kublai did not attempt to coerce conquered people to convert their faith. In reality, he did precisely the opposite. He informed leaders from many faiths that theirs was his favorite. That made them happy, so they didn't try to overthrow him. Kublai Khan studied the teachings of Jesus and Buddha. He hired Muslims to work in his government. He also respected rules of a Chinese philosopher named Confucius, who was born in 551 BC. Confucius taught that people should treat others as they'd like to be treated. He also taught that everyone should be educated, not just rich people. This was a very unusual idea at the time. Kublai Khan's grandfather Genghis had already conquered northern China. In 1279, 4 years after the Polos arrived, Kublai conquered southern China, his most significant military victory. Kublai grew even richer by taxing the wealthy cities of southern China and his other new lands. Marco called him the most powerful of men in subjects, lands, and treasures that there is on earth. Even though Kublai had murdered many people and grabbed their land, Marco thought he was a fair ruler. When farmers had a bad harvest, they didn't have to pay taxes. Hungry people were fed for free with corn, wheat, rice, and other grains in storage. Marco wrote that Kublai Khan was the wisest man and the ablest in all respects, the best ruler of his subjects and the empire, and the man of the highest character of all that have ever been in the whole history of his people. Genghis Khan, 1162–1227. Genghis Khan was Kublai Khan's grandfather. He was one of the most skillful and feared military leaders ever. In 1206, he united Mongol nomads into an army. A year later, he led them on the first of many bloody invasions of surrounding villages. Within 50 years, his army had conquered 2/3 of Asia. His empire grew to include parts of Russia, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and northern China. His wars were cruel and his laws were strict. He claimed any town he wanted for his own. Sometimes he stole its riches, then burned it down. People were scared he would kill them if they put up a fight. Some surrendered without a struggle. After his death, other Khans took over his conquered lands. Eventually, Kublai Khan became one of those rulers. Chapter 5. Marco works for the Khan. Kublai Khan liked Marco because he was intelligent and amusing. According to Marco, over the next 17 years he was sent on missions to different areas of the Mongol Empire. Marco never said precisely what the Khan asked him to do on these missions, but he did say he always did a good job. Part of his job was snooping around. After each mission, he gave the Khan a report of what he'd done and seen. These lively reports entertained Kublai. They were much more interesting than the dry facts the Khan's other men reported. Marco took notes as he traveled. He brought interesting stories from faraway lands back to Kublai's court. He wrote that he tried to gather knowledge of anything that would likely interest the Khan. It seemed that Marco had a bright future working for Kublai Khan. In his book, Marco's stories don't strike modern readers as all that entertaining, but people wrote in a much more formal style back then. One story Marco wrote about was the day he saw what he thought was a massive 15-foot-long snake. He said its legs each had 3 claws. Its jaws could swallow a person. This turned out to be a crocodile. Marco had never seen coal before. He was amazed to see people burning black rocks. The Mongols had one of the first pony express systems for sending mail. Marco was impressed by how fast Kublai could send a message. There were 10,000 stations about 30 miles apart along the major roads throughout the Khan's lands. A messenger could rest at a station, get a new pony, and continue carrying news. Foot messengers carried a rider's news from the stations to nearby villages. The Mongols had destroyed some cities that Marco visited. Many villages in the region of Tibet had once been beautiful. But when Marco got there, the people were gone. Only tigers and other wild animals roamed the ruins, making it extremely dangerous. Marco saw paper money for the first time in China. Paper had been invented in China around 105 AD, more than 1,000 years before Marco's arrival. At first, pieces of old fishnet, rags, hemp and grasses were used to make it. They were boiled until they turned mushy, then they were flattened and dried. Later, paper was made from bark. Marco wrote that paper money was made from the bark of the mulberry tree, the leaves of which are the food of silkworms. The bigger the piece of paper money, the more it was worth. In most of Europe, people didn't know how to make paper during Marco's time. They didn't have paper money until the 1600s. Marco decided that paper money was better than the heavy coins back home. Instead of paper, European books were handwritten on vellum or parchment. Those were made from the skin of animals such as sheep, calves, pigs, or goats. It was more complicated and more expensive to make than paper. The Chinese printed books and money by hand-pressing paper against ink-covered letters or pictures carved on blocks of pear tree wood. Woodblock printing was faster than writing by hand, but it was still a slow way to make a book. Chinese printing designs were drawn on paper, then carved into woodblocks. Movable type was selected from a tray of clay characters, and then was arranged in an iron frame and held in place by wax. The block or frame was then inked and pressed onto paper to make multiple prints. Marco was surprised by the loudest bang he'd ever heard in China. It was the sound of gunpowder exploding. Many centuries earlier, the Chinese had invented gunpowder, but Europeans didn't know about it. In the middle 1200s, an Englishman named Roger Bacon figured out how to make gunpowder, probably after studying a Chinese firecracker. The first known gun was made in China in 1288. Guns were used in Europe as early as 1314. Chapter 6, Fierce Mongol Warriors. Marco described many Mongol battles in his book. Some he witnessed, others he merely heard about. One of Kublai Khan's lengthy battles had ended 2 years before Marco arrived to write about it. It was an attack on a city along the Han River that began in 1268. The city was built like a fort with a wall. Kublai's commanders could not get inside the walls to attack, so they formed a circle around the city made of soldiers, ships, and a wall of dirt and mud. The people couldn't get past them to get supplies. Kublai's commanders tried to attack the city several times. There was a bloody battle each time, but neither side would give in. This went on for 5 years. Finally, Kublai sent 2 engineers to help conquer the city. Outside the walls, they built tall catapults called mangonels. Mangonel is based on a word that means engine of war. It launched giant stones, darts, burning tar, and even poop over the city's walls. If an animal died from disease, they shot its body over the wall too. They hoped to spread so much disease among the people inside that they would have to give up. And at last they did. Kublai tried twice, but he was never able to conquer Japan. This shocked both Europeans and Asians, who'd begun to think the fierce Mongol army couldn't be defeated. Mongols liked to stage surprise attacks whenever possible. They were quiet at first and used flags or lanterns to communicate. Sometimes they shot whistling arrows as signals to each other. When it was time for troops to attack, a commander told his musicians to beat big drums. A Mongol warrior fought with swords, spears, axes, and even lassos, but his primary weapon was his bow and quiver of hollow reed arrows. Because the bow was short, a soldier could swiftly shoot it while riding a horse. It shot arrows twice as far as the bows used in Europe. The Mongol bow hit its target more often too. However, it took greater strength to shoot an arrow from a Mongol bow. Mongol warriors were very good riders. They each brought several ponies with short, powerful legs on long trips. When a pony got tired, its rider switched to a different one. Sometimes Mongols rode day and night. They ate and slept while riding. They were only able to conquer lands where grass grew. That's because their ponies needed grass for food. As Kublai Khan got older, he couldn't ride anymore. In 1287, one of his relatives tried to overthrow him. Kublai and his troops went to the Liao River to fight him. But Kublai was so tired that he could only watch from a wood tower carried by 4 elephants as his soldiers defeated his relative. If you were Mongolian at the times of Marco Polo, you were a nomad who herded sheep, goats, or cattle. You probably lived in a big tent called a yurt. You drank mare's milk and ate meat. You never lived in one place long enough to grow a garden, so you had to find wild berries, nuts, and vegetables to eat. You prayed to many household gods but believed in one supreme being. Your most important possession was your horse. Horse stealing was punished by death. Chapter 7. Trapped. Marco was now in his late 30s. He had spent half of his life in China. He, his father, and his uncle had a treasure of jewels and gold. Kublai Khan was in his 70s by then. In those days, very few people lived that long. In his last years, the Khan became ill. The Polos worried he might die. Some Mongols were jealous of Marco because the Khan liked and trusted him so much. Once Kublai died, would Marco be imprisoned or killed? Several times the Polos had asked the Khan if they could leave China. He liked having them around, so he always said no. Marco was stuck. Traveling home to Italy would have been too dangerous without the Khan's protection, but in 1291 the Polos got lucky. A 17-year-old Mongol princess was being sent to Persia to get married. Women didn't travel alone in those days. The princess needed many guards and companions. Her guards thought a trip overland would be too arduous for her. They wanted to travel by sea. Marco had just returned from a voyage to India. Since he knew the route, he would make a perfect guide. The Khan had a tough choice to make. He wanted to be sure the princess arrived safely, but he didn't want Marco and the others to leave. However, he eventually agreed to let them guide the princess. Kublai gave the Polos 13 ships with 600 servants and crew members on board for the trip. He also gave them messages to deliver to the kings of France, England, and Spain. To protect the travelers, Kublai gave the Polos 2 golden tablets. They were each about 1 foot long and 4 inches wide. A message written on them ordered everyone they met along the way to be of help. If they weren't, Kublai might see to it that they were put to death. Chapter 8. Delivering the Princess Bride. Kublai's golden tablets acted almost like a magic charm, protecting the Polos as they traveled homeward. Marco later wrote that throughout the Khan's lands they were supplied with horses and provisions, and given 200 horsemen to escort them and ensure their safety from one district to another. The Polos sailed through the China Sea, past Vietnam. Heavy rains called monsoons forced them to land on the island of Sumatra. They stayed there for 5 months. Cannibals, people who ate human flesh, tried to attack them. Marco was amazed by the unusual things he saw in Sumatra. In his journals he wrote that he tasted a nut he said was the size of a man's head. It was a coconut. He wrote that he saw a unicorn. What Marco actually saw was a rhinoceros. He also claimed he saw small, hairy ape-like people called orangutans. Were these creatures real? No one knew for sure. However, even today some people claim to have found bits of their fur. On the island of Sri Lanka near the southern tip of India, Marco met a king who owned the most enormous ruby in the world. It was as long as the palm of his hand and as big around as his arm. Along the coast of India, they saw divers hunting for pearls. Merchants hired the divers. They also hired magicians to cast a spell on the ocean. The spell supposedly kept the divers from getting eaten by sharks. Their sea voyage took 26 months, more than 2 years. By the time Marco landed in Hormuz, all but 8 of their 600 crewmen were dead. He never explained how they died, so no one knows what happened to them. They probably died from disease, storms, or attacks by pirates and bandits. Or maybe there never had been 600 crewmen to start with. When they finally docked in Persia, there was terrible news. The princess's fiancé was dead. Nevertheless, a wedding took place. The princess married his son instead. Then came even worse news. The great Kublai Khan had also died. Now Marco could never return to China. Without the Khan's protection, traveling in Asia was not safe. The Polos headed for Venice, traveling by camel, ship, and on foot. In Turkey, they were robbed. Marco didn't tell how much of their riches were lost. He also did not tell why going such a short distance took over a year. Altogether, it took them 3.5 years to travel from China to Italy. Today, this trip can be made by airplane in less than a day. Chapter 9. Home again. When the Polos finally arrived home in 1295, their families didn't recognize them. After all, They had been gone from Venice for 24 years. Their skin was darkly tanned from the desert sun. Their clothes were dirty and ragged. They looked nothing like wealthy merchants. Some people didn't believe they were the Polos. A few days after their return, there was a feast. Once everyone had eaten, the Polos brought out the clothes they had worn on the way home from China. They ripped the seams with knives. Rubies, diamonds, and other jewels fell out. Although people now believed they were the Polos, not everyone believed the tales of their travels. Marco's stories seemed wild to people who had never been outside Italy. For instance, other Venetians laughed at him when he claimed he had seen a unicorn. Soon Marco settled back into life as a merchant. It probably wasn't as exciting as working for the Khan. Almost immediately, war broke out between Venice and another Italian city-state called Genoa. These two city-states had a history of fighting. Both wanted to be the most powerful in Europe. Marco became the gentleman commander of a Venetian ship. This sounds like a prestigious title, but a more experienced captain was really in charge. In 1298, ships from Genoa sailed southward around the boot of Italy and then turned northward into the Adriatic Sea. They planned to attack Venice's navy, the biggest in Europe. They had started with about 94 ships. 16 ships had been lost in a storm along the way. Venice heard that Genoa's navy was coming. They sent 95 ships to fight them. The two navies met in the Adriatic Sea. For a while it looked like Venice would win, but then all 16 of Genoa's lost ships showed up to join the fight. Venice's ships were defeated in just one day. Genoa's navy captured about 7,000 Venetians, including Marco. In the 13th century, Genoa and Venice both had mighty navies. They traveled the seas in wooden ships called galleys. A galley was narrow, usually about 150 feet long, but only 16 to 25 feet wide. It had a few sails but was mostly man-powered. 100 or so oarsmen sat on benches that were set in rows along each side of the galley. 3 men sat on each bench. Each man rowed a different oar that was about 30 feet long. They had to be good at their jobs, so their oars didn't bump into each other. 6 doctors might be on a galley, but there was only 1 cook. There were as many as 20 musicians. During a battle, they banged drums and tooted trumpets, hoping to scare the enemy. A galley crew wore helmets and armor and fought with spears, swords, and crossbows. They shot arrows lit with fire at an enemy ship's sails. Sometimes they threw a powder called lime at enemy soldiers to burn their eyes and skin. It was more than 100 years after Marco's death that ships first had cannons. Chapter 10, the famous book. Marco was put in a Genoa jail for about 10 months. There wasn't much to do, and the other Venetian prisoners were probably bored. Luckily, Marco was a good storyteller. He entertained them with tales of his travels. An author named Rustichello was in the same jail as Marco. He thought Marco's stories were fascinating. He offered to help turn them into a book. It was an excellent way to pass the time. The two men began writing. Marco told his stories aloud while Rustichello wrote them down. Marco couldn't remember everything. He decided he needed the journals he'd written in Asia, so his father sent them to the jail. No one knows how much Rustichello changed Marco's stories. The book is written in different styles, depending on which of the two men was writing a particular part. Other books Rustichello had written before were adventure stories about noble knights. Rustichello likely tried to make Marco's stories extra dramatic. Marco was set free after Venice and Genoa signed a peace treaty in 1299. He returned to Venice with the book he and Rustichello had written. Marco titled his book The Description of the World. Later it was called The Travels of Marco Polo. It was divided into an introduction plus 4 main parts. The introduction told readers about the Polos making 2 trips to China and meeting Kublai Khan. Part 1 was about Marco's trip across Asia toward China. Part 2 described Kublai's empire. Part 3 was about Japan, which Marco never visited, and Marco's journey home from China to Venice. Part 4 wasn't really about his travels. It described Mongol wars. In his book, Marco didn't write much about everyday things, conversations, or friends he'd made in Asia. These things would be very interesting to readers today. But Marco didn't think readers of his day would care about such information. The Travels of Marco Polo is mostly a geography book, telling about the lands the Polos visited. Just 55 years after he died, Marco's book was used to help create a famous world map. The original version Marco and Rustichello wrote in jail has never been found. No one knows how many copies of the book were made. In Marco's day, books were handwritten by monks in monasteries using goose quill pens. It took between 3 months and 3 years to make a beautifully illustrated book. So there weren't many books around. About 150 handwritten copies of the book are now in museums and other collections. No two are exactly alike. A good printing press wasn't invented until the 1440s. In 1477, Marco's famous book was machine printed for the first time. The first copies were in the German language. Soon the book was reprinted in English, Spanish, and almost every other language in Europe. No wonder Marco Polo became famous. The book is still in print. Copies can be found in many libraries today. About 120 years after Marco died, a German named Johannes Gutenberg, circa 1390 or 1468, invented a new way of printing. He created a different kind of press that used separate metal letters to form words and sentences. Before Gutenberg, an entire piece of text would be engraved on a piece of metal called a plate, and all the words would be printed together at once. It was a very time-consuming process, and none of the individual words in the text could ever be used separately. But Gutenberg's individual letters were used to make up words that could be set up quickly in lines to form a page. The letters were reusable. The first book he produced on his press were Bibles. He began printing them in 1452. After the pages were printed, he sent them to a bindery. There they were glued and stitched together along one side to form a book. Because of Gutenberg, more books were published in the following 50 years than had been produced in the previous 1,000 years. Once books were cheaper and easier to get, more people learned to read. Each time Marco's book was copied, some words were changed. Sometimes that was by mistake. Mistakes were especially easy to make when the book was translated into another language. Other times, the scribe or printer changed Marco's story on purpose. For instance, when the book was translated into Irish, the printer knew his readers liked exciting stories. He made changes he thought they would like. Chapter 11. Were Marco's stories true? Most historians think Marco Polo did go to China with his father and uncle. The real question is, how much of what he claimed to see and do was stretching the truth, what we call tall tales? In his book, he used large numbers to describe amounts, sizes, and distances. He said the Chinese city of Hangzhou had 12,000 bridges, but it had far fewer. He said Kublai sent an army of 360,000 horsemen and 100,000 troops to fight his enemies in 1287. But there wasn't enough food near the battlefield for so many troops or grass to feed that many horses. Most people who first read Marco's stories had never traveled far from home. They didn't know much about the world. To them, Marco's stories about strange lands and people seemed too incredible to believe. They decided that the book was nothing but a million lies. This helped earn him the nickname Marco Millions. For a while, another phrase for an exaggeration was a Marco Polo. At carnivals, clown puppets nicknamed Marco Millions told wild stories full of exaggeration to make the crowds laugh. Some of Marco's stories were wild. He claimed there were magicians in Kublai Khan's empire who could make glasses of wine fly. He said they could change day into night and turn a sunny day into a rainy one. Today, some people wonder why he didn't write about the Great Wall of China in his book. Maybe it didn't amaze him. Much of it had been destroyed by the 1200s. It was rebuilt and lengthened when the Ming family ruled China from 1368 to 1644. People also wonder why his book doesn't mention the Chinese custom of tea drinking. This may be because tea was most popular in southern China. Marco spent most of his time in northern China. Marco wrote that he was the governor of a Chinese city named Yangzhou for 3 years, yet he never described his job. Most historians don't think he learned to speak Chinese. Therefore, it's hard to believe that Kublai chose him to govern a Chinese city. In China, historians kept careful records, but a government worker named Polo is only mentioned once. If Marco worked for the Khan for 17 years, why wasn't he mentioned more often? Did he use a Chinese name most of the time? Maybe, but it's odd that there is no record of the arrival of 3 Europeans in China in the 1200s, and what happened to the jewels Marco supposedly brought home. In 1300, 5 years after his return from China, he got married at age 45. He and his wife, Donata Baduer, eventually had 3 daughters, Fantina, Belela, and Moretta. When he died, he didn't leave his family a great fortune. That makes his stories about going to China seem false. But a list of his belongings around the time of his death suggests that he did leave behind one of Kublai Khan's gold tablets. That makes his stories seem genuine. Where else would he have gotten something like that, except from the Khan himself? Could he have bought it, stolen it, or had a fake tablet made? Whatever the case, Marco's book spurred on other explorers. Christopher Columbus studied it and made notes on the pages. He longed to reach China by a quicker route than Marco Polo had found. He sailed west from Spain in 1492, hoping to find China. He didn't realize that North America and South America blocked his way. Vasco da Gama was also very interested in the book. Eventually, he found a new sea route from Europe to Asia by sailing around the southern tip of Africa in 1497. The Silk Road wasn't used as much after that. Marco was 69 years old when he died in 1324. At that time, most people had decided he had made up the stories in his book. As he was dying, his friends begged him to confess the truth and say that he'd been lying. He refused. His answer to them is now famous. He told them, "I never told half of what I saw.